All right, at this point, I would like to hand it over to Kathleen to go ahead and get us started.
Thank you, Jen. Good morning, everyone. We are so thankful you're here with us again today. This is part 3 of the Spring Training 2021 webinar series that's being brought to you by Starbridge, Parent to Parent, Families Together in New York State, and NRCIL. As Jen had mentioned, if you could please put yourself on mute so that while she is presenting, there's not any background noise. We are very thankful to have her today. Jennifer Sibley is a family peer advocate with NRCIL, and she's going to be talking to us about looking ahead to school in the fall. So Jennifer, thank you so much, and we look forward to your presentation.
All right, thank you so much for having me today. Today's topic is looking ahead to school in the fall. So as we know, there's a lot that we don't know about what happened with COVID. There were so many different things that happened when school first shut down back in March of 2020. So on March 16th, Governor Cuomo started issuing some executive orders, basically stating that all schools were going to be closing down as of March 18th. And we didn't know what that meant. All we knew at the time was that it was supposed to be short term, only for 2 weeks. But we all know what happened next. So with that shutdown, we had to figure out, how do we educate students during a pandemic? And what we found was that there was lots and lots of challenges for our students. Some of those challenges included access to technology. Especially for students in rural areas, it became really difficult for our students to be able to access education remotely. Access to internet for students, especially again in remote areas, became really difficult for a lot of our students to be able to do. A lot of our parents also had issues with being able to teach their kids and being able to access some of the updated technology. Older parents, parents who had children from the foster care system, grandparents who were raising children that are their grandchildren, had never had to use some of this technology before. And now we're being thrown into this new world of teaching and learning. And they didn't get a chance to learn how to use some of this technology. So there was a rocky start for a lot of these students trying to access a lot of this information because their parents had never used this technology before. For a lot of our students with disabilities, sensory challenges became a huge issue. I know one of the things that was difficult for my son, who is 18 and is on the autism spectrum, was seeing himself on camera for telehealth sessions for speech. He loves to ham it up. And so when he saw himself on camera, he was less inclined to pay attention to what his speech therapist was doing and some of the other kids in the group, and more inclined to watch himself make faces at himself on the camera. So having those sensory challenges for some of our kiddos was really difficult. Some of our kids didn't want to see themselves on camera at all. And some of our kids had a really difficult time understanding that the person that was on the camera on the other side was an actual human being, and it was somebody that they needed to interact with. So sensory issues became a real challenge for a lot of our kids. Home life challenges were definitely an issue as well. For some of our kids, remote education took a back seat to a lot of these home life challenges. You had concerns about COVID. Family members were getting sick during this time. And if you had parents, siblings, grandparents, other family members who were getting sick, you weren't going to be able to concentrate on logging into a Zoom meeting and attending a class because your parent was sick or you were getting sick yourself. So it became really difficult. If you had other issues that normally would have been taken care of had you been attending school on a regular basis, such as food, clothing, shelter on a regular basis, and now you didn't have access to those things, those definitely interfered with your ability to receive an education. Domestic violence concerns also came to a forefront with a lot of our kiddos during this pandemic. So if your child if you had a child who was living in a domestic violence situation, of course, education was not going to be a priority for them. And these kids who might have been able to have a spotlight shown on what was going on at home now didn't have an extra set of eyes shown to see what was going on with them at home. And so we didn't have a lot of oversight for these kids to protect them from what was going on. And for a lot of our parents, especially our essential workers who didn't have a choice but to work outside of the home, childcare issues became a real concern for home life challenges. So kids were having to be left at home with either childcare providers or having to go to a daycare setting. And that made education a real issue because kids were sitting in daycare when they should have been logging into Zoom classes. And that made it difficult for parents to manage those different roles. Remote instruction is definitely not for everyone. And we found this out very quickly, especially for a lot of our kids with disabilities. Being able to connect over a computer is very different than being able to connect over a classroom setting. And again, for our special education students, they lacked a lot of those services that were set up either on an IEP or an individualized education plan or a 504. And some of those things included access to related services, access to specialized instruction, and access to accommodations and modifications. So things that they would have had set up in a normal, regular classroom setting, they didn't have access to over a Zoom setting or a virtual setting because they just didn't have the capacity to set those things up, or the school just didn't have the ability to provide those accommodations right away, especially with regard to related services. Schools really had to scramble to figure out how do we provide related services to children when we can't provide them one-on-one, face-to-face. It really took a long time for schools to be able to set up telehealth services, get approval from the state, and be able to have the technology to be able to access those services and then be able to coordinate those services with families to get those services going. So a lot of kids missed a lot of related services and had to set up compensatory ed in order to have those services be meaningful and beneficial for them. There was also a lot of challenges for our parents, including balancing home and helping with school. And I know this was something that was a huge concern for a lot of us here in our office. At NRCIL, a lot of us on staff, actually all of us on staff in the Family Support Services team, are parents of children with disabilities, as well as being family peer advocates. So not only are we juggling working remotely full time, but we're also working with our children who are learning remotely and having to figure out how do we strike that balance. And I know we definitely weren't the only ones because we were working with other parents through these same concerns and issues. So as a parent, how do you find that balance of being able to work from home, being able to continue to provide all of the support and structure as a parent that you need to provide at home and help your child be able to access their education? Other parent challenges, and I've touched on this briefly in the other slide, was not understanding technology. Some of our younger parents were able to log into Zoom. They had access to their own computers. But again, some of our older parents struggled with understanding technology. They'd never had to use Zoom before. They barely were able to have emails. Some of our parents never even had smartphones. So they didn't understand or weren't able to log into some of the programming from school. And our schools were so overwhelmed that they didn't always have the time to be able to sit with parents and help them be able to access those supports. So not being able to access school staff for support was also a huge issue. And again, it was because our teachers and our administration were so overwhelmed dealing with their own concerns that sometimes they didn't have the time to respond to parents. It wasn't an excuse, but it was definitely one of the reasons why our parents were struggling to be able to keep up with some of the demands of COVID. The lack of ability to help with curriculum. Some of our parents, because of their education level and because of this lack of being able to understand this technology, weren't able to keep up with the curriculum. So if their kids were learning in Common Core math and they had never had instruction in how to support a child in Common Core math, they weren't able to help their child. And so their kids were falling behind in the curriculum. And then you have your normal family hardships like feeling isolated because of COVID, finances, job loss, stress and anxiety, et cetera. All of those things contributed to some of the parent challenges about why it was so difficult for parents to be able to help out with education. So some of the other issues that we ran into with COVID-19 included our graduating seniors last year. And we had to figure out, how do we help our kids graduate when we can't see them in person and they're not able to complete some of those graduation requirements. So ultimately, the New York State Board of Regents decided to cancel Regents exams last year. This is because they couldn't really come up with a good way to provide Regents exams under those current COVID restrictions at the time. So graduation requirements were modified at that point so that those Regents requirements were not required for them to graduate, and they modified the course requirements so that credit was given for passing the class without the Regents. And again, our kids missed out on a lot because of COVID. So there was no formalized graduation ceremonies. And if they were with social distancing, or they were over virtual platforms because we couldn't have in-person ceremonies. Lots of schools didn't have senior trips. They didn't have proms. They didn't have a lot of the other things that traditionally our senior classes would have been able to participate in because of COVID. So educators and parents were not prepared for the school shutdowns, and we knew that. We learned at the end of last school year that more work needs to be done to help educators become more flexible. And so our schools decided at the end of last school year that they were going to devote more time and energy into helping their teachers learn some more flexibility and to put some more time and energy into teaching their teachers how to be more flexible and how to teach in a more technologically advanced world. They spent a lot of their time and budget on helping solve some of those technology woes. They invested more in being able to provide more Chromebooks, more access to Wi-Fi hotspots, and being able to help solve some of those technology issues. They also invested some time and energy into how to care for vulnerable students when school is not in session. So those vulnerable students included students with disabilities, students who are living in poverty, and students who are of different races. And then they thought, uh-oh, summer is coming. Now what? Because COVID was still in place, and although some of the restrictions had started to ease as of last summer, they still were in place, and our kids still needed to be provided an education. I'm going to take a break at this point to ask Kara and Tina if there are any questions that have come up in the chat.
Hi, Jen. The only question that I see is that, are there any tips that you would have yet for a parent as they're thinking about the school year ending and summer's coming? What could they do proactively?
So that is actually a wonderful question. And we are going to touch on some advocacy tips as the end of the school year comes, because with the next school year coming, we still have a lot of uncertainty about what next school year is going to bring for 2021, 2022. So we will be talking a lot about some advocacy tips you can use to help you be able to work on what's going to be best for your students. So hold that thought. We're definitely going to be covering that topic, but it's a great question. So thank you for that. Is there anything else?
Yeah, the only other comment that we have, Christine shared, it's ironic that the school district would be teaching teachers to be more flexible when typically the district is more rigid in how they approach things.
Isn't it ironic? Yeah, absolutely it is. And it's so funny because a lot of times they were teaching teachers to be more flexible and trying to get educators to be able to teach to a broader audience and to teach in more flexible ways. And yet they weren't, a lot of our educators and a lot of our school districts weren't willing to be more flexible to some of our students. And what we found in our advocacy work is that a lot of the accommodations that some of our students needed weren't being provided because educators were being inflexible about things. So if a student needed to join a Zoom meeting but couldn't have their camera on, we had staff members being insistent that they had to have their cameras on. Otherwise, they couldn't count them for attendance. Or, they had to turn in a certain project in a certain way. Otherwise, they couldn't get credit for it. And yet we had ways to prove that the student was working on the assignment. They just weren't able to turn it in over the internet because they didn't have access to the internet. And there was so much inflexibility that it was really difficult to work with some of our schools on helping these kids be successful without having this rigidity in place. So you're absolutely right. It's a great point. All right.
That's all, Jen. Thanks so much, everyone. And continue feeling free to put comments or questions in the chat, and we'll raise those as the time comes up.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So I like to call last summer the summer that wasn't. And the reason I call it that is because for a lot of our kids, summer should be a time where they can relax and they can rest between school years, but there really wasn't anything open. And there was a lot of things that our kids just weren't able to do. And I feel like from an education standpoint, last summer was broken down into two parts. The first part being that with everything closed from COVID, again, there really wasn't much for our kids to be able to do over the summer. A lot of our summer camps, water parks, amusement parks, fairs, parades, etc., they were all closed. And so parents had to come up with really creative ways to be able to keep their kids entertained. And unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of leeway for parents to be able to do that. Even things like our public libraries weren't often open to having kids come in and be able to check out books. You had to check them out virtually, and you had to come in and pick them up at a standard specific time. And it really wasn't user friendly for a lot of our parents because, again, our parents were trying to work, our parents were working remotely, and our parents were trying to just keep their heads above water. A lot of our families ended up having to rely on community agencies for supports and help for getting through this past summer. I know at NRCIL, we were very busy just helping parents stay afloat and making sure that their mental health was sound and that they were getting support and taking good care of themselves, as Tina mentioned a few weeks ago during her presentation. And then around late July, early August, schools began to start focusing on what the next school year was really going to bring. And so they began to plan publicly for what the next school was going to look like. So there was lots of public Zoom meetings. There was lots of socially distant public forums, information sessions online, and planning committees comprised of faculty, administration, parents, and students. And what they were doing was trying to come up with a good plan to be able to get students back into the classroom as much as possible, but still comply with COVID regulations. So with that, what they ended up coming up with was different models for what the next school year was going to look like. So starting off in the 2021 school year, most schools went with one of three different options. For some of our very small school districts that were able to comply with COVID regulations of keeping students 6 feet apart with masks when they couldn't maintain social distancing, and being able to provide transportation with the social distancing in place, some of these smaller schools were able to be fully back in. So again, these smaller schools were socially distanced, transportation was able to work, and for some of these small schools, they found that remote instruction didn't work for them because of technology woes. So they were able to put together a plan to get their kids back into the classroom, and that worked great for them, and their students really benefited from this kind of plan. The majority of districts ended up going with what we call the hybrid model. And what that means is they often split their students into cohorts or smaller groups. And they divided their schedule between in-person days and remote instruction days. So they would have half of their students attend in person while the other half was remotely instructed. And then they would switch those groups out halfway through the week so that the other group was in person while the other half of the group went back to remote instruction. Oftentimes they would have at least one full day off somewhere in the week to allow for a full cleaning of the school. But this was for some of our mid-sized districts and some of our other districts, the only way that they could really comply with COVID regulations of social distancing and transportation. And this model worked for some students, but it failed abysmally for a lot of our kiddos. And what we found is that a lot of our kids were really struggling with this model. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Finally, for some of our very large districts, especially in New York City, Los Angeles, and some of our other more urban areas, they ended up having to stay fully remote. And this is because even with social distancing in place, they weren't able to split their students into cohorts that would be able to fully bring their students back in any capacity. So they really had to focus on remote instruction, and they had to fine tune their plans for remote instruction to make it work for all of their students. So now I want to give you guys an opportunity to chat in what some of your experiences have been. So how did this school year start off for you in your particular school district and for the families that you work with? And so I will share as you're chatting in that my son goes to Indian River, which is kind of a mid-sized district here in New York State. And because he is a student with a disability, he was able to come back 4 days a week with social distancing because he's in a self-contained classroom. And that really worked well for him. But he's one of the lucky few that were able to come back with somewhat of a smaller setting that worked for him. But I know that that's not the case for every student. So if you have a chance and you want to just share a little bit about what model your school district came up with and what you experienced in your school district, that would be great, just so we get an idea of where everybody was coming from. And I'll let Kara and Tina jump in and tell us what's coming into the chat.
So we just got one in so far, Jen. I love it because everyone's being really detailed. Alicia shared that she has a senior and a special needs child this year, and it's been very difficult. Their school completely forgot about all the things that makes the senior year so special, and they developed a parent group and are trying to get funding and provide the kids with those experiences and memories.
Absolutely. Yeah, a lot of our kiddos really, really missed out this year on being able to fully participate in those things that make senior year awesome. Anyone else want to chat in about what their school district was doing this year?
Hi, I was able to get my phone unmuted. Mary said I have a senior in one district that started virtual, then went whoop, my whole screen just switched. Then went hybrid. My home district was face-to-face the whole year.
Oh, nice.
Nice. And then Christine said, FYI, there is a federal program to help with internet costs for those low-income families. Yep, which is awesome. They will temporarily pay $50 a month until fall. That's the cable companies, which is awesome that they've come out with that.
Absolutely. And we've shared that at our agency with a lot of our families. And I love that there's that new benefit out there.
And then she's commenting that Spectrum won't do it if you already have service. So that's important to note. So here's another one that came in from Karen. It says, it was really great that the alternative high school and elementary schools were open every day. The hybrid model was difficult for everyone, but particular hard for kids with disabilities. Absolutely, those kids were struggling.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. Absolutely.
And I think that's the last one so far, Jen.
Okay. All right. So yeah, it seems like there's a good mix of in-person and a lot of hybrid. Not so many people with remote instruction or solely remote instruction. So let's talk a little bit more about students with disabilities during COVID, because it was interesting to see just how some of our students with disabilities dealt with COVID, and some of our kids thrived. Remote learning worked great for some of our kids who were struggling to sit still for long periods of time, and having that ability to take breaks in between instruction and being able to participate remotely, because that works well for students who have anxiety and aren't necessarily able to participate in a full classroom setting where there's lots of eyes on you, and lots of eyes in the setting, paying attention to what you're doing. So for some of our kids, remote instruction worked great. Kids who are tech savvy did phenomenal during the remote instruction time. And we found for some of our kiddos, they were able to take advantage of some of the tech accommodations that are available on Google Classroom. And those were very helpful as well, especially if we had teachers providing that instruction that were able to utilize those accommodations on Google Classroom. So that was great. But for a lot of our kids, COVID was not such a great thing for our students with disabilities. For some of our kids with anxiety, being on a screen and not being able to have access to a teacher was extremely frustrating and anxiety inducing, because they didn't have an opportunity to be able to ask a question right away. Having a million faces on their computer screen and not knowing if somebody was staring at them, if they were able to engage the teacher if they needed to, was frustrating and stressful. Students with autism struggled with remote learning, because again, you're losing a piece of communication when you remove face-to-face instruction, and being able to interpret things over an internet connection becomes extremely difficult for a lot of our kids with disabilities. Students with learning disabilities struggled with remote instruction, especially if they weren't able to receive their accommodations like resource room and consultant teacher services, and being able to receive instruction in a way that was beneficial for them. Students who are nonverbal really struggled with remote instruction as well, because when services are received over telehealth and you're not able to respond over the computer, you have no way of really being able to show that you're gaining meaningful participation from the instruction that you're learning. So there was lots of barriers and lots of ways that our kids were really struggling when they had disabilities over remote instruction. Other struggles included ensuring that accommodations are met. And that was one of the things that we struggled with a lot here at NRCIL, is making sure that kids who had individualized education plans and 504 plans were having those accommodations provided. Even things like copies of classroom notes were difficult for some of our kids to get, because teachers just assumed that they were printing them off the computer. Well, what if the family didn't have a copy or access to a printer? They weren't able to print those things off. Accessible curriculum became a difficult thing for a lot of our students, because if they're not able to interact with a computer screen, then they're having a really difficult time being able to gain meaningful instruction. Helping parents help their children, especially, again, those parents who are older and maybe not as familiar with technology, or grandparents who are raising grandchildren and have never had to have used technology to provide an education. Parents becoming the instructors. This was one thing that I struggled with my son doing remote instruction, because Wyatt didn't learn very well from a computer screen. So a lot of his instruction was provided over worksheets. And so I found myself having to provide a lot of instruction for him. And it took away from time that I was supposed to be doing work myself, because I had to sit with him and make sure that he understood how to do his addition, how to do his subtraction, how to make sure that he was completing all of his assignments. And so I took over that role as his classroom teacher when I really shouldn't have had to do that. But that was one thing that I ended up having to take on because he needed the instruction, he needed the assistance. And that was something that a lot of parents struggled with over COVID. Chromebook refusal and attendance issues. These became huge talking points for a lot of our parents because, again, if the only way the teacher is allowing to take attendance is when your camera is on, then those students who struggle with having the camera on during instruction are getting marked down for something that they can't control, or they're having a really difficult time struggling with because of sensory issues or whatever other issues they're struggling with. So parent or teachers not being willing to accommodate students with disabilities in this new teaching environment really became a sticking point for a lot of families in administration. If you had any other issues with students with disabilities, go ahead and type those into the chat. I'd love to hear what other kinds of concerns that you ran into with the families that you're working with, or your own family if you're a parent who has a child with a disability. And I'll defer to Kara and Tina again to answer some of those things from the chat.
You had several comments still from before, so I think they're very important, so I would like to read them.
Sure.
Somebody's basically saying, I have a family with a child with autism who still won't get off the bus and go to school. So they aren't helping the families, which means the school. They're just okay with the Zoom. And then Mary is saying, I too work with a family with a youth who has autism spectrum disorder. It has been a challenge to get the youth back into the building. So kids are struggling just to walk back in that building due to mental health. And then we're getting into masks. I know people who choose remote because the masks were a non-starter for the kids.
Yeah. Yeah, masks were an issue for a lot of our kiddos this year.
Yeah, huge. And then Christine was saying districts won't even return a parent's call that she's working with, and a parent doesn't fax or email, and the parent needs to get a functional assessment done. So we're going back and forth with some stuff like that. And then this person says, Katie, I have a student I've worked with that they preferred to be in the school because they knew they would not do the work at home. They'd rather be in school. That's a choice for some people, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And Wendy, for the children struggling, having the parents arrange with the school for them to attend a few hours a day for a while, then gradually building the time to half day, 3/4 day, then a full day. It's an idea of how to get the kids back into the building. I did this with family and it worked out great. So there's a great idea of how to get some of the kids back in the building.
And that was something I was going to suggest. So I'm very glad that you put that in there. I love you guys helping each other out with these suggestions. That's phenomenal.
And Katie said, plus missing that social interaction and not seeing friends. I think kids were starting to lose social skills and continuing to be glued to the computer.
Yep. Huge, huge challenge.
Huge challenges. And then I've got many families had to deal with CPS involvement while the youth were refusing to go in person due to anxiety. Yes.
And it's funny that you mentioned that. It's not funny, but one of the things that we've had to deal with a lot of our families is CPS involvement for remote instruction. And we actually, one of our advocates found a guidance document from Office of Children and Family Services that is meant for school districts on when they should and should not report families for educational neglect due to attendance issues. That's something that I'm willing to share with you all. So I'm going to write a note to myself to share that with you when I send out a copy of the PowerPoint, because I think that that's really powerful information for you to have as guidance for you in working with your families. So.
And I think this is a very important comment. I mean, there's some other ones here. However, schools are getting very comfortable doing Zoom with kids with disabilities, and I don't think that comment's meant in a positive light. Mm-hmm. Versus having them in the building, let's just do a Zoom with some of the kids, and that's not right.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I think we should be focusing on bringing all of our kids back into the classroom setting, but especially our kids with disabilities.
Mm-hmm. So I think that's about it at this point in time, Jen.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I was going to say, for time's sake, let's go ahead and keep moving with the presentation. So we did find some new challenges with 2021, especially when we were looking at that hybrid model of education. Many of our students didn't adapt well to the hybrid education model, and that led to a high number of our students failing this year. One of the reasons that has been surmised for students failing is this lack of access to their teachers and lack of access to being able to interact fully with a lot of their peers, because we know that a lot of that education is socially based. And so when you're spending the majority of your time on the computer, as one of you chatted into the chat box, you're missing that key component of education, which is that social piece. And the quality of the education is somewhat lacking when you're using a combination of in-person and remote, because when students are attending remotely, you can't really gauge how well they're actually participating in the instruction, and whether it's due to a lack of accommodation, whether it's due to an inability to access the programming itself, whether that's because of issues with parents being able to assist a child. There's so many different factors affecting why a child is not able to fully participate in remote instruction, that we really had a difficult time helping these kids learn from the hybrid model. The other thing that we had to factor in was the fact that because school shut down in March last year, a lot of our kids entered the school year with a lot of regression and a lot of learning loss. And so when we tried to start off this school year from where they should have been, what teachers were finding is that these kids really had experienced some substantial regression in their education. And they had to do a lot of catching up for these kids because they weren't at where they were supposed to be. And it was really frustrating for a lot of our students who lacked some of that key core educational building blocks. And so that loss of education and that regression in those skills really was a detriment to a lot of our students. With hybrid instruction, there was a lot of inconsistency with schedules and a lack of extracurricular activities. And we know as parents and as advocates that these consistencies and inconsistencies contribute to overall mental health for our students. And when your mental health is not at its best, of course, you're not going to be learning at your fullest potential. We also found in our area, and I'm not sure if this is true statewide, that there was issues with protection of health information. And that was seen in particular when, especially in smaller school districts, you got those blanket letters stating that a student in your district has been identified as testing positive for COVID. When you are from a small rural area and you get that letter in the mail saying someone in your classroom has tested positive for COVID, it only takes a few phone calls to find out who got sick and who wasn't in class today. And so it became really difficult to protect someone's private health information with this COVID outbreak, because it was just difficult to protect public health and at the same time keep people's private health information private. Again, we still experience that lack of accommodations and a lack of communication between home and school. And parent stress and burnout continued to multiply during this past school year, especially because now, as COVID restrictions have started to lift, parents are returning to work. And with the changeover from administrations at the federal level, there was a lot of changes and a lot of uncertainty as far as financial stability is concerned. And so parents were under a lot of stress for a short time in trying to figure out, how am I going to make ends meet? And so that really contributed to overall household stress. And I'm sure students were picking up on that as well. Then as the vaccine started to really roll out for a lot of our families, the question came, do I vaccinate or do I not? And I'm going to do my little disclaimer and let you know that my role here is not to tell you whether to vaccinate or not. That's personally your choice. My discussion today is more or less in letting you know that this is something that families are really struggling with right now, especially families that have children that are in that 12 to 18 age range and trying to figure out whether they really want to vaccinate their child or not. And this is a concern for a lot of our families. So trying to figure out, is my child eligible? Is it something that I really wanted to have my child do? Is it available? What are the health risks? There's a lot of information out there that our families are trying to weigh and figure out whether it's really going to be beneficial for them in the long run. And that is really helping to, or that's really weighing on a lot of our families' minds as well, and contributing to this overall feeling of stress and burnout for our families. So they're keeping that in mind as the restrictions start to open up, and we're trying to figure out whether we mask, we don't mask, whether schools are going to open up full time, and fear of repercussions are opening up the debate on both sides. And it's becoming really difficult for families to figure out what is the right thing for me to do. So now we're at the end of this school year, and we're trying to get to the end of June. And some of the things that we're looking at right now are passing Regents exams in order to graduate. For the second year in a row, that has been suspended for at least the month of June. I don't know if it has been extended yet until August. I do believe that it has been extended to the August Regents, but I'm not 100% certain on that. I will look into that and let you know. But you are able to go to the New York State Education Department's website to find that information out. And I will give you some resources as well that you can look into if you want to find out more information. Graduation requirements have again been amended to allow changes in credit requirements for graduation for our students, especially our graduating seniors. Some schools are re-examining pass-fail options to allow more students to move on to the next grade level despite failing grades. And I think what they're doing is they're looking at overall effort for their students and not grade levels or grades, because they're recognizing that this year has been particularly difficult for students trying to pass using this hybrid model. And so knowing that it's been difficult for their students, they're trying to figure out, is it more beneficial to pass these students on to the next school year and hope that we're able to have more students in person next year? Or would it be better to hold them back next year and try to provide instruction in person next year to get them caught back up? So this is one of those catch-22s that our schools are caught in right now. Summer school and extended school year options are expected to continue in person, excuse me, with COVID guidelines in place as much as possible. And if you've been paying attention to the news, there has been some recent rumblings from the CDC stating that school children do not have to wear masks anymore. But New York State has come down and said, whoa, wait a minute, we're not ready to release that mask mandate yet. So hold on to that. So as of right now, summer school will be fully open in person, but students will have to wear masks. And I'm expecting that they're still going to have to use social distancing. Telehealth services will also remain an option for students who require extended school year services. This has come down from state ed as well, and this information is available again on the New York State Education Department website. So now you're probably asking, okay, that's great. Thanks for the recap. What's next? So what we do know is as the number of people who are vaccinated increase, the likelihood of schools fully reopening is also going to increase. Some social distancing and mask mandates may remain in place depending on the school district size and the location of the students within the school building. I would imagine that high schools and school buildings that have older students who are able to be vaccinated will be less strict on mask mandates than would be the lower elementary grades, just because of the COVID vaccination rates. Although stay tuned for that, because I know they're doing testing on younger children about COVID vaccines and whether they're effective or not. Some mask mandates may return during the cold and flu season to protect those who are not vaccinated from transmission. And again, we expect to see a spike in COVID transmission rates during cold and flu season, just because we know that COVID mimics a lot of the flu symptoms and is very similar to the flu virus. So we expect that we're going to see an increase in numbers during flu season. And it's very likely that because of the success of using hybrid and telehealth services, that some of those services will remain in place, especially for students who may need those accommodations in order to fully participate in their education plans. I would imagine that schools are going to encourage students to attend in person as much as possible, but those options will remain in play for students who might need them. What we don't know is to what extent hybrid or remote education will remain in place for next school year. What will classrooms and transportation look like in the fall? And again, those mask mandates, what is that going to look like? When I put this PowerPoint together, that was before the CDC's announcement about schools not having to have masks in place for students anymore. So we'll definitely have to stay tuned and pay attention to what New York State Education Department decides for their students across the board. So definitely pay attention to what's going on in the news and what's coming across the New York State Education Department.
Jen, this is Kara. I just want to jump in there real quick because there was a timely comment in the chat that tied in with all of that about the masks. Mary raised, she thought the guidance from Albany was no mask mandate for schools. It is up to the discretion of the school district, and that was as of Monday. And I raised that just because there was a lot of conflicting information between Friday and currently today out circulating. So if we could just bring clarity, that would be great.
So I looked at it this morning, and as of this morning, from the New York State Education Department and from Governor Cuomo's office, the mask mandate will remain in place for all students in New York State public schools for now. However, they are looking at the mask mandate and they are seeking guidance from the CDC to determine whether that mask mandate will remain in place or whether they are going to loosen the restrictions on the mask mandate. But as of this morning, it's still in place for all students who attend New York State public schools. That's the latest that I have.
Thanks for that, Jen. I know right now it can be confusing. There's so many things we have to track and keep on top of.
Absolutely. And that actually brings me to my next slide, which is where do I look for guidance? Because there is so much conflicting information out there. And without really knowing where to turn for the latest and most up-to-date information, it can get really confusing about where do I go for answers to all of these questions, because I just don't know who to trust anymore. So I would encourage you to familiarize yourself with the New York State Education Department's website on coronavirus. They do have the most up-to-date information on coronavirus, COVID-19 regulations and how they impact our schools. So there is the website there, and I will be sending out a copy of the PowerPoint hopefully tomorrow, if not by the end of the week, so that you have access to this information. You can also go to your district's website. Most school districts do have a link to their up-to-date COVID-19 regulations and their district policies related to COVID-19. So you can always check on your district's website, or you can check with your local BOCES as well. If your student has, if you are a parent of a child with a disability and your child attends a BOCES classroom or a BOCES program, your local BOCES website will also have up-to-date information on COVID regulations and what the latest COVID guidance is for New York State schools. So I know that somebody had asked earlier, like, what's the best way to advocate? Because with so much up in the air and not knowing really what do I do to make sure that my kid is getting the best possible outcome, I don't know where to turn. And so I would say to help your child, you're going to have to gather some data and get some information. And Kara shared with me right before this presentation a really great worksheet that she's put together for her families that talks about what kind of education have they been receiving this past school year, what things have been working well, what things have not been working well, what areas are their strengths, what areas do they need to improve on. So gathering that information together, whether it's through the worksheet that we're going to hand out to you guys, or just writing some notes to yourself about what things have been going well and what things have not been going well. And taking that information to your school district and saying, this is what I need help with, and this is how my child is going to learn best. Make sure you're doing your homework and asking questions. If you're finding in late July, early August, when the school comes up with their plan for instruction for next school year, that they plan on doing a hybrid model again, talk to your district and ask them, is there any alternatives? Is it possible that my child can cross cohorts? Would it be possible that remote instruction is not a requirement for my student because of the relaxing restrictions on COVID regulations? And let them know, give them the data that shows, my child failed last school year because they were on this hybrid plan and it didn't work well for them. And this is why I'm advocating for full in-person instruction. Know what works and what doesn't work. Again, if you know your kid does great with remote instruction, but they can't have their camera on, explain that and show them the data and the information that goes with that. Ask for accommodations, knowing that your kid is going to be starting the school year off in person, but they've really struggled with instruction this past year. Ask them for different accommodations. If you're not sure what those are, at least start that conversation with the school and say, he's really struggled with math this year, and I think that he could benefit from some assistance while he's trying to get caught back up. Are there some accommodations that you can provide for him while he's working to get caught up to where he's supposed to be? If the answer is no, which is quite possible that the answer is going to be no, politely ask them why and get it in writing, because sometimes the answer is no simply because they don't want to deal with it. And that's not always the best reason to get the answer for no. So if the answer is no, get it in writing, and then you can pursue whether that's actually a no or whether it's an I don't want to. And then you can look into knowing your rights. If you can't find it for yourself, you can call Kara, you can call myself, you can call Tina, or you can call another advocacy agency and try to find out, this is what the school has said to me, and it doesn't feel right or it doesn't sound right. Is this really true? And what can I do from here to help get my child the support that they need? What questions do you guys have for us? Because I left a lot of time for questions on purpose, because this is such a broad topic and there's so many unknowns about going into the next school year that I really wanted to leave a lot of time for question and answers with you all. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so that you can see my face. Hello. And open it up for questions from you guys. So what questions do you have?
At this point, there's some people that are putting their information in the chat box that they can help in certain regions as well, which is fabulous. That's how we help each other and support each other.
Wonderful.
But I think everybody's got to start to type, so let's give it a few minutes or a few seconds. While we're doing that, Jen, I want to add, in my region, I'm down in Albany, Schenectady region, and we did hear the same thing about the mask mandates, okay? But talking with many CSE directors and superintendents, they're saying that they're going to go by what CDC says to an extent, and then they're going to make up definitely their own plans for the masks for the kids because they just feel it's time. And some of our districts right now, kids don't even have masks on.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm a little kind of surprised by that, but they're doing what they have to do.
Yeah, that was the latest that I had heard from the New York State Education Department website this morning and from Governor Cuomo's office. And like I said, I looked it up this morning. But it's always changing. Just when I think that the regulation says one thing, 2 hours later, it's changed and they decide that they're going to do something different. So when in doubt, look up what the regulations say, call your local school district and get the latest from your local school district. They're used to having those questions asked of them. Don't be afraid to make contact with your school and ask those questions because the only way you're going to know is if you ask someone. So make sure that you're making those connections along the way.
All right, we've got a question that came in. My daughter's school called Monday and are continuing with masks until the county decides.
Okay. Yeah. And again, it's really going to be up to what the state comes down with, what the county regulations say. Districts are really waiting. I know my district has sent out an alert over the weekend to all of their parents stating that they are waiting for state guidance. So when the state finally says, yes, we are releasing students from the mask mandate, that's when they are going to let families know that they can unmask.
And this is Kara. I also want to just chime in on this whole piece as well, because many children, as we know in New York State, also have seasonal allergies. And that has posed a challenge with masks and symptoms and all of that piece of the regulations. What I would share with families is, in addition to reaching out to your school, also know that your county health departments, while they are extremely taxed right now, they are a fantastic additional resource to help you with sorting out what type of documentation do you need if that is your situation and you need help with trying to get your child to be able to attend school while maybe they're being removed due to having seasonal allergy symptoms.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Kara.
While we're waiting for some things, I'm just going to throw something out. I'm hearing many school districts, the kids haven't been in school in over a year and a half. And now some of them have gone back for a few months. And some districts are trying to say they want the kids now in out of district placements. Because they've been home, they've only been back in school for a few months, and now they're trying to look for out of district placements because they say the kids can't function. And the parents say their child needs time to reacclimate themselves to the buildings, to their surroundings. I don't know if that's what anybody else is hearing, but that's happening a lot around here.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, we're able to stop it, but it's not, the point is, this is what they're doing, and it's not the children's fault that they have not been in school.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would remind families and advocates that are on here that maybe don't have a lot of information about special education processes, that anytime a district is looking at change of placement, it has to be based on solid data. And if there's no data to back up that decision to change a placement, then you need to be asking the district what data they're basing that decision on. And it can't just be because of COVID and we haven't had school in 15 months. That's not a good enough reason to change a placement for a kiddo. They really have to try putting them back into their regular pre-COVID placement and gather the data on that placement before they decide that this is not working. And then they can reconvene the Committee on Special Education, which includes the parents and the student if it's appropriate, and then say, this is not working based on this information that we've collected. And now we need to look at changing the placement. But that's the only reason that you should be looking at a change of placement, not, we haven't been in school for 15 months and we don't think this is going to work.
Right.
And I also wanted to share with that, Jen, Terry raised in the chat about her son's school program at BOCES has stated there's no remote option for their summer program. And also right now, state ed and the governor are planning that there will not be a remote option in the fall as well. So preparing families for that, because some students, as we said, did very well during remote learning.
Mm-hmm.
Others did not, but regardless of how these students are learning, they need a re-entry plan. What is coming back to school going to look like? It's not just suddenly I'm a student and I can put on my clothes and my backpack and I'm ready to go. Our kids have a lot that they need support working through, and falling back into what was school and what does that look like right now.
It's an incredibly powerful point. And, a lot of our kids who were used to remote instruction, we can't expect them to be fully thrown back into a full-time school program without some sort of transition process. So we do need a reentry plan for those kids, even if it's talking to the CSE chairperson and the building principal and saying, you know what, he's been on a computer screen for 15 months now. Can we plan on visiting the school a couple times over the summer, just so he can get used to walking around the building again? Visit the classroom that he's going to be in. Maybe plan a Zoom meeting with his teacher next year so he can at least put a face to a name. Planning those things for fall will help be able to reacclimate our kids back to what school will look like in the fall, so that they're not just going to be plopped like a fish into the ocean, and not used to being back in the classroom setting. That's a really great point, Kara.
There was another family that said a similar thing, but their child does very well with the remote, and that's what they're hoping they can do for next year for his senior year.
Mm-hmm.
You have some people talking. I am preparing families for no virtual options, which that's what Kara just said, that most schools are planning no virtual options. Mm-hmm. And some may qualify for medical or home tutoring, which definitely have to see how that works with doctor's orders. Mm-hmm. In-person is a very big concern for my family, and that was Terry. I have declined the vaccine for my son and myself. This is another big concern for me, and that's a personal option. Everybody has to decide what is best for their family with regards to the vaccine. I think you mentioned that, Jen.
Yeah. And it's important to note too, for those families that are concerned, that the COVID vaccine is not going to be a required immunization for students to attend school in the fall. I know that there has been some discussion about that, but it's very similar to the flu vaccine in that it's a recommendation from the New York State Health Department, but it is not a requirement for you to have the COVID vaccine in order to attend school in the fall. So if you are hearing that, please know that that is not something that's going to be required of your student in order to attend school. It is a personal choice for yourself and for your family. And if you are hearing that, please make sure that you're contacting your local Department of Health to get clarification on that.
And Jen, Katie raised another really good point about the family really doesn't want to do an online option. Basically, the senior really wants to just have support with paying for this online program because they have a lot of stuff going on with both of their parents having some pretty major responsibilities and the kid needing to pay for this by himself. He just wants to try to get onto a different path. And with Katie, I would just say a lot of our students have taken on different and new responsibilities during this time beyond just signing on to their Zoom meetings, of helping to support their siblings, having to learn how to do some life skill stuff of cooking and managing their day and their time. So it's intense, and it's going to be a big chunk that I think sometimes we don't realize the ripples of kind of coming out from COVID and all that we're going to have to work through. So I encourage you, keep communication lines open with your school district, with your community. Reach out for support, because it sounds like that family really could use as many supports as we could wrap around for them.
One option that we haven't talked about, and it's something for families to keep in mind as well, is that with schools reopening and more schools looking for an in-person option, families do have the option to homeschool as well. And so for some of our families, that in-person option is still scary for them and is not something that they're willing to entertain, even though it's not a publicly funded school, and they would have to take on the responsibility of providing that education for their child. Homeschooling is definitely a valid option for you to start exploring. And if knowing that your school is going to be in person and that's not going to work for your student, and your district is not offering any alternatives, now is the time to start really looking into those options and looking into curriculum choices, so that you can start getting your ducks in a row for homeschooling. Because taking on the task of homeschooling your student is, it's a big task, and it's not something that you can enter into lightly, but it is an option for families to look into. So I would encourage you to talk to your families, or if you are a parent attending this workshop yourself, look into that as an option as well. Contact me, Kara, or Tina if that's something that you are interested in. Christine, I don't know if you have a lot of information on homeschooling, but any of us are happy to pass along that information to get you started on the process, because, you know, we can really, I can help you at least. I know I have a lot of experience with homeschooling families myself. So again, it's something to think about as schools look at returning their kids back to in-person instruction. If that's something you're not comfortable with and there are no other options being offered by your district, it is something that you can start looking into.
And Jen, we just, Sue shared in the chat about having a call about one school with many children that are sick from the heat that we've been experiencing these last few days, and mask wearing, and families being concerned about what they can do, what they can't do. No real clear guidance. They want to comply. It's only a last couple of weeks. It's not that many days. What advice would you share for families that might be facing that right now?
So one of the first things that comes to mind, and this is an exercise in creative writing for me, is have your family go to their child's pediatrician. If your child has heat sensitivity, which my son suffers from heat sensitivity because he has sensory issues, you can have your pediatrician write a note for an accommodation for air conditioning. And then your school would have to provide an air conditioned setting. They actually have things like portable air conditioners now that are pretty cost effective, and they're not expensive for the district to purchase. And it's something that you can have added to your child's IEP as an accommodation. The other thing I would say is, and I lost Sue's comment, so I'm going back up to it. Last few weeks of the school year, is that if you are worried about your child being able to pass with these last few weeks, now is the time to really look at that open communication piece. Have those conversations with the district staff, especially the teachers, about what is lacking, and if my child is on the edge of passing, what do we need to do to make sure that he is going to pass? And if there is nothing that they can do in order to pass this grade, what are the options for summer school? And what will that look like for my child? Because then you need to really make the decision of, is it worth it to put my child through summer school this year? And if it is, then you need to make that decision about accommodations. If it's not, Then you need to decide, well, if I'm not going to put him through summer school, does that mean that he's going to fail and have to repeat this grade over again? Or does the school have a policy where they move kids on to the next grade regardless of what their grade levels are? So those are definitely things that you really want to have conversations with your district about. How in jeopardy of failing are they? And if they are, what does that look like? What can I do to help my child? And where do we go from here?
So Jen, I just want to chime in on that because some of our districts in my area, they're not failing the kids. They're not going to hold them back. They're not going to retain. Districts don't like to retain as it is. So what they're really doing is more so moving the kids on, providing extra supports and services. Mm-hmm. Believe it or not, some are actually doing compensatory services, which is a shock. So I'm very proud. Not all, but you take what you can get. Every little day is a difference. But that's a huge thing because parents have called and they want to try to keep their kids back, and that's not something I see happening anywhere really.
Yeah.
Because we should keep back every single kid then, if that's the case, because they all struggled.
Yeah, and I will say that the students failing the grades because of the remote instruction, it's not a unique thing to one district. It's a statewide phenomenon. A lot of districts are experiencing the same issues. And so a lot of districts have been struggling to try to figure out, what do we do? Do we move these kids on and hope for the best? Do we keep them back and hope for the best? Do we put them all through summer school and hope that they learn something from summer school? Nobody has the answers, and it's because nobody's ever been through a pandemic before. And so nobody really knows what's the best course of action to help these kids be successful in school. So I'm going to go back to what Kara did 2 weeks ago and talk about open communication. You really have to have these tough conversations with your school district. Make sure that you're having these conversations, you're talking to the right people, you're being open and honest about the possibilities. If your child is failing miserably and they haven't really put in a good college try and making sure that they're doing their due diligence, maybe it's not because the accommodations haven't been working. But if they've really been trying their best and they're still struggling, then that's when you have those conversations about, look, they're doing everything that they can and it's still not working. But that open communication with your school district is so important, and I can't stress that enough. But that's the only way that you're really going to come to a good, solid conclusion about what's going to work best for everybody involved.
And I just want to chime in on something, because as we're all talking to families, some families are like, well, school is in session over the summer. There is summer school and the buildings are still open and CSEs meetings are still happening. So I want to make sure everybody on here knows school is still functioning in every district over the summer. Administration is still there and you can still have meetings. So everything that you're talking about right now, Jen, is important for people to know. There's still time to go back if they need to set up those meetings and not feel like they don't have that time to do that, because they do. And right now that's huge.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to take a moment right now to allow Kara to share her screen so that she can show you the document that she's developed to help you all be able to gather that information about what works best for your child, what will work best in coming up with some data collection for you to be able to share with your districts. So go ahead, Kara.
Thanks, Jen. So when I was talking with a lot of families, they felt like it was overwhelming to try to put down all their thoughts. And so in partnership with some of the families that I've been helping to support the last few weeks, we came up with an idea of a reflection sheet. And so you would have a spot where you could note the year, your child's name, their grade, and then the type of schooling I thought was really important, of not only noting which one, because for some of our children, it was multiple types of schooling this past year. So making sure when you note that, like for example, my children started completely remote at the beginning of the year. So I would write September remote, Then my children shifted to hybrid, and I would circle that. And then I would also circle in person for when my district transitioned into that piece. So just in the course of 1 year, my own children have gone through 3 different types of schooling. And it's important to note that because our children got impacted in different ways from that different type of instruction. But then documenting what did go well, if anything, and maybe your what went well is we survived. We are still standing here today. Might not have been pretty, but we made it to the end of this school year and we did the best that we could. Some of the things that were a challenge for your child, maybe your child really struggled with signing on, or maybe a challenge for your child was visually seeing themselves on the screen. It was too much. For some of the challenges that you might have seen for your child, it could just be they missed being with their friends, or they missed being able to raise their hand and say, I need help, and having a teacher that could just right there in that moment support them. So whatever you noticed as challenges. Also, what I think is important is to notice for yourself, what did you learn about your child? We could have learned all different things. Our kids maybe learn best at a certain time of the day. Maybe we learned that our kids really are good auditory learners, meaning they hear a lot, even if they're doing something else or fidgeting. Maybe we learned how resilient our child is in some way. Maybe there was something that we learned about how they process information. That could go in that area. Then thinking of what was at least one success your child had in the last year. Don't think of success as being 100% celebration over the top. What's just one thing that maybe they're able to say, I'm proud that I was able to do this. Maybe it was a certain assignment. Maybe it was a Zoom that they were able to participate in. It could be anything. Then the next part, because I know we all have a lot of things that sometimes we can list out. What is your biggest concern? Or in some cases, what are your top 3 concerns for your child? Because as I talk with many families and we hear about all the challenges, I'm like, that's a lot. And it can be a lot to sort through. So prioritizing and picking, where do you want to work first? Where do you want to start? Because as Jen shared, this is a transition back in the fall. We can't take it all on right now. We have to prioritize and pick and choose what will help our child the most for preparing for the fall. Then these next 2 questions are super important. How is your child doing emotionally? And how is your child doing socially? And I add those in because when we think about mental health, it has a stigma sometimes attached to it. But we need to start thinking of our children's and our own as parents' mental health being just like our physical health, our dental health. We go to doctors, we see providers for those. So why are we not talking about our mental health in such a normal, casual way? All of our children went through a lot. How are they really doing? Have they been that child that has trudged and had like the stone face and maybe they haven't really told you how much they miss maybe some of those activities they would have had? Has your child been in tears or more angry or more irritable on the edge? How are they doing? And how are they doing socially? Are they ready to be back with their peers? Are they ready to handle when conflicts happen? Because we all know when we get together with people, there are differing opinions which can lead to conflict. Are they ready for that? Are they ready to be talking to somebody, not through a screen? It's different. Are they ready to be able to say when they need help? Or for how some of you in the chat shared about the masks, are they able to tell somebody, I need a mask break? Those are big things. And for some of our kids, they need support in being able to do that. And then at the end of the sheet is additional comments and notes because every child is unique and different. And so I wanted to give parents a spot where maybe I didn't ask the right question or give the right prompt. They'd have a space to capture their thoughts somewhere and pull it all together. So we're hoping that this sheet will be helpful as you're trying to capture what happened during this past year, because it's been a year and everyone has done such great, incredible work. And together we're going to figure out, how does this transition back happen and how do we support each other in it?
And Kara, I wanted to share that there was a comment that one thing that you might want to add, and maybe this can go in that additional comment section, is identifying someone within the district who's been an ally or someone who's worked really well with your child.
I love that. I will add that in and resend that to you, Jen.
Thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. because I want to share with you how you can get a hold of us if you have any questions. So, so that's our contact information. And I've included Tina, Kara, myself, and Sue and Kathleen. So that if you have any questions along the way or you run into any roadblocks, you have a way to get a hold of any of the 5 of us so that we can answer those questions. So Tina, again, is from Parent to Parent of New York State. Tina covers the Northern New York and the Capital Region. And her number is there. Kara is mainly Central New York, but Kara is also part of Starbridge. And Starbridge provides services across New York State. So I've also included the main number for Starbridge so that if Kara doesn't happen to provide services in your area, you can be connected to another family education specialist in a different area that may be able to answer your questions or provide you with some feedback. If you live in Jefferson, Lewis, or St. Lawrence counties, you can give me a jingle and I'll see what I can do to help you out, or I can point you in the right direction. And Sue and Kathleen are always available to provide you with some assistance or give you some resources to point you in the right direction as well. And Sue and Kathleen are Families Together New York State parent advisors for the Central and Northern New York region. All right, so I will ask Kara to once again put the link to our evaluation survey in the chat box so that if you haven't had a chance to provide us feedback on today's workshop, you can click on that link and that will take you to the SurveyMonkey for today's workshop evaluation. We read all of the comments and all of your feedback on every presentation, and they have been extremely helpful so far. And we really appreciate everything that you guys have written in. My favorite comment so far has been that the chat always feels like it's a support group, and I couldn't agree more. I feel like these have been therapeutic, not only for you guys, but for us as presenters. So thank you for that. We really do read all of the information that you guys provide for us, and we can't thank you enough for attending these workshops. They've been very helpful for all of us, and we hope that you feel the same way. With that in mind, we'll give you a minute or two to chat in any final questions or thoughts before we end today's webinar. And as you're typing those in, we would like to take, or I would like to take a moment to thank you all for coming to this webinar today on looking ahead to school in the fall. I'd like to thank my co-presenters for everything that they have contributed to this 3-part series. And that would be Tina from Parent to Parent of New York State, Kara from Starbridge, and Susan Lewis and Kathleen Leka as parent advisors from the Families Together New York State. So once again, my name is Jen Sibley. I'm from Northern Regional Center for Independent Living here in Watertown. And yes, we did record today's session. So we will be sending out the recordings. More than likely, we will send you a link to all 3 recordings for all 3 of our workshops at the same time so that you can view all of them at your leisure. And we will be sending a follow-up with a copy of today's presentation, as well as some follow-up materials from today's workshop as well. So with that, if there are no other questions, again, thank you all for attending. We really appreciate your time and your feedback, and we hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day.
We want to thank Sue and I want to thank you, Jen and Tina and Kara, for your amazing series. I think it was extremely educational, and for myself, who I don't have children in school anymore, it's good to stay up to date on what families are experiencing. And we are very thankful that you were available to do this series. And if anybody, like Jen had said, has any questions, needs support, we are all here for you. And I wish everyone a beautiful summer. I hope that we can get back to whatever our normals are and that our children will adjust and adapt back to whatever is best for them in the fall. So thank you so very much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.